One of the pleasures of being the dean of a great law school like this is to be able to welcome all of you to special lectures like this, and to be able to not only acknowledge the great speaker that we have, the great talent that we bring to campus, but the wonderful benefactors who make it possible. So today, I welcome you to the Case Western Reserve University School of Law's Judge Ben C. Green Distinguished Lecture in Law, one of the highlights of our academic year. I'm pleased to welcome this year's lecturer. I'm a member of her fan club and have been for a long time, the eminent legal historian Mary Dudziak, who is the Judge Edward J. and Rui L. Jurado Professor of Law, History, and Political Science, visiting us today from the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. We're also fortunate to welcome Ms. Roe Green, a great friend to Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Roe is the daughter of the late Judge Ben C. Green, an alumnus of the class of 1930, and his late wife, Sylvia Green. In 1961, Judge Green was the first School of Law graduate to be appointed as a federal judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Ohio. That appointment was made by President John F. Kennedy, and Judge Green served with distinction for 20 years. Judge Green, who possessed a true passion for his legal education, was highly regarded in his profession and his community. He also embraced a passion for politics and a commitment to the integrity of his long judicial career. Fortunately for the School of Law, he also inspired the extraordinary philanthropy of his late wife and daughter, who together established the Ben C. Green Visiting Professorship, which is now a permanent chaired professorship held by my great colleague, Kevin McMonagle. Later, Roe, on behalf of her family and in honor of her late father, gave the largest individual outright gift in the law school's history in order to enable us to significantly renovate the library into the beautiful facility it is today, and then went on to endow the lecture series we'll enjoy this afternoon. Ms. Green continues to be one of our most beloved friends. Other recipients of Roe's inspiring philanthropy include her graduate alma mater, Kane State University, where Roe established the Roe Green Center for the School of Theater and Dance, the University of Colorado's Theater and Dance Department, where Ms. Green received her undergraduate degree, Florida's Maltz Jupiter Theater, and the Jewish Community Center of Cleveland's Arts Program. Roe doesn't know yet about my plans for the Arts Law Center here at the law school. We are most fortunate to have the generosity of this extraordinary person, a woman with just multifaceted interests and talents, and her extraordinary family. Moreover, if I may say so, having been engaged in what one might describe as intensive fundraising since June 1st, it is rare to see a person give with the joy of creating opportunity for others that motivates Roe. A joy that motivates her many commitments, and a joy that motivates her life. It is our honor to say thank you. Roe, will you please stand for a moment? Now for the work. I'd like to turn things over for the work to Professor Robert Strassfeld, Associate Director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center and Director of our Institute for Global Security, Law, and Policy, who will introduce our speaker. Regrettably, I can't stay for the speech, but Mary did a lunchtime talk for the faculty, and if that was any preview, you're in for an enormous treat. Bob?
Thank you. Thank you, Roe, and thank you all for coming. I will make the introduction short, though for a terrific lectureship, an important lectureship, it is appropriate to have an important and terrific speaker, and we do have that here today. Mary Dudziak is a graduate of University of California at Berkeley, and then Yale Law School and Yale University, where she earned both her JD and her PhD. You have a biography and a bibliography in the materials, and the biography is incredibly impressive, and the bibliography goes on beyond actually what you've been given. She is the author of multiple important works of legal history, beginning with Cold War Civil Rights, Race and the Image of American Democracy, in which she looked at the interplay between Cold War concerns about the image of America and the civil rights movement, and the sense of the United States that it was important for us to get civil rights right, because the eyes of the world were upon us. She has continued to write in 20th century U.S. legal history, most recently a forthcoming book, which will be the topic of her discussion today, Wartime, an Idea, Its History, Its Consequences. She comes to us from the University of Southern California, although by way of Duke University School of Law, where she is visiting today. She is the recipient of too numerous a list of awards and fellowships to name, so I will just tell you that they are there, and get out of the way and let Mary talk.
Thank you so much, Bob. Can everyone hear me? Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank Dean Mitchell. I'd like to thank Ms. Rowe Green. I'd like to thank my friend Bob Strassfeld, who I've known since we were practically little kids, law clerks on the Fourth Circuit. And I'm just so pleased to be with you today. Now, you may not have noticed, but late last summer, the conflict in Iraq ended live on NBC. On August 18, 2010, NBC news anchor Brian Williams announced breathlessly, "It's gone on longer than the Civil War, longer than World War II, and tonight, U.S. combat troops have pulled out of Iraq." Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel was embedded with the 4th Stryker Brigade as soldiers dramatically and slowly drove across the border from Iraq to Kuwait. "This has been a historical moment that we have just seen," he said, though the history-making quality of this episode required some explaining. 50,000 American troops were remaining in Iraq, fully armed, and reports of American casualties would continue. It didn't look much like the end of a war, but wars end like this. MSNBC host Rachel Maddow insisted. President Obama then followed up with an address to the nation on August 31. Although he did not speak from the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, this was nevertheless our new president's mission accomplished moment. Obama called the events historic, coming after nearly a decade of war. Although the nation's unity had been tested, he argued, there was one constant. At every turn, America's men and women in uniform have served with courage and resolve. The nature of that mission seemed obscure, and the president did not illuminate it. But once deployed, the personalization of American war support by the president and others meant that the nation could rally behind its soldiers without engaging the war's broader purpose. The pullout was simply a convoy of brave Americans making their way home. Now, Operation Iraqi Freedom was now replaced by Operation New Dawn. Just how different these missions would be was clarified when practical questions emerged. If combat was over, would American troops no longer be eligible for hostile fire pay or for combat service medals? Well, the Army responded with a message to all troops. And this is a quote, "The end of conflict operations in Iraq was effective September 1, However, combat conditions are still prevalent. Due to the nature of combat conditions, wartime awards will still continue to be issued in theater until a date to be determined. Reporter Thomas Ricks said, "It's unusual for the Army to come right out and say that the Emperor has no clothes, but I think it had to in this case because soldiers take medals seriously." Perhaps the paradoxical nature of this ending that was not an ending explains the absence in Obama's speech of the president's usual rhetorical power. Grasping for metaphors, he emphasized that American troops are the steel in our ship of state. Our nation may be traveling through rough waters, but they give us confidence that our course is true and that beyond the pre-dawn darkness, better days lie ahead. And so the mission had devolved to supporting the troops, while the troops themselves gave the mission meaning. This circularity befitted what the president called an age without surrender ceremonies, an age when conflict could end even as it remained ongoing. Now, I think we see in this episode a more enduring problem. President Obama takes an era of ongoing military conflict and tries to place it into a conceptual framework that simply doesn't fit. The conceptual framework is the idea of wartime as a temporary rupture of normal time. Built into this way of thinking is the assumption that war is always temporary. This set of ideas informs American legal and political thought, and my new book simply seems to call attention to this way of thinking, which is endemic. Obama is simply one example of a much longer problem, from my perspective. So I simply seek to call attention to this way of thinking, to think about it, and to examine its lack of fit. Scholars who write about the impact of war on American law and politics tend to closely examine the law part of it, but take war as a given. They read each other, works about civil liberties at wartime, but they don't actually read military histories, at least represented in their footnotes, or diplomatic history that closely examines the nature of war. But if we really want to examine war's impact on law and politics, we have to look critically at both sides of the equation. We have to examine as closely the war and the geopolitics that we think are impacting American law, as well as those impacts on the ground we see in American legal doctrine. My project basically argues that a set of ideas about time, historical time, are embedded in the way we think about war, that this set of ideas affects writing on the history of law and war, and it doesn't fit the history of American military engagement. Once we start looking at the war part of it, the legal scholarship on the impact of war and the military and diplomatic history scholarship on war itself, they're sometimes not even periodizing the same wars in the same ways. And just to give you the sort of sense of the overall project so you can see where the little pieces I'm giving you today fit in, the first chapter literally talks about time, which I'm going to talk about with you today, how we might think about wartime as a form of time. Then chapter 2, I'll also tell you a little bit about today. Well, we know that some wars are neatly bound in time, like World War II, right? Well, we'll think about it. The Cold War is a period of ongoing, sort of ambiguous, smaller scale wars that on its face, the name of the era Cold War is intentionally ambiguous. But scholars tend to try to jam it back into a pre-existing conceptual structure, wartime, peacetime, so they can compare the Cold War as a war with other wars to see, how do we do on civil liberties compared across these wars. So that's what I do in the book. So in scholarship on law and war, this is basically the architecture of our thinking. There's two kinds of time, wartime and peacetime, and history consists of moving from one kind of time to the next. Okay? I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Across the time zones, is the swinging pendulum, right? Swinging from security in wartime and rights in peacetime. And you can see this sort of metaphor built into judicial opinions, scholarship on law and war, even popular culture. So what's the matter with this? From my perspective, there's at least a couple of kinds of problems that we need to think about. First, that this way of thinking about war helps us imagine war as temporary, bound in time. And second, a historiography problem that historians and other scholars often look for war's impact only within these sort of pre-existing time periods that they think of as being our only war times. Now, there's a lot of attention paid to the impact of wartime on American law and politics, but not to wartime as a kind of time. Now, there's a reason that we have this thinking about wartime in our heads. The onset of war is experienced as ushering in a new era. So after Pearl Harbor, for example, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter says to his law clerk, "Everything has changed and I am going to war." Now, just as a sidelight, he actually was thinking about war, and it was all he could think about in the course of writing an opinion for the court in the Gabaitis case, upholding a flag salute requirement so that children who were Jehovah's Witnesses refused to salute the flag because they thought it was worshiping a graven image. So they violated the law, were thrown out of school. And this opinion for Frankfurter was all about national security and essentially how to protect national security at wartime. He wrote it while France was falling to the Germans and was just simply obsessed with the war in Europe. So the thing that's so interesting about Frankfurter is he's both talking to his colleagues, should I talk about the war and how national security should figure overtly in the case. And he talks about national security, but he doesn't talk about the war in Europe in that case. But nevertheless, he's already dealing with war in his thinking, but nevertheless, he experiences Pearl Harbor as this break, as this shift, as this opening of a new era. But the onset of war, and this is, I will keep saying over and over again, isn't just seen as this catalytic moment, but is seen as the opening of an era that has temporal boundaries on both sides, so that when we enter a wartime, we've entered an era that we, by definition, imagine has a necessary endpoint. So in order to think more about this, first we have to think about time. Anthropologist Carol Greenhouse argues that we tend to think about our time, linear time, as natural time, something that comes from nature, and the kind of time that other people have, that's socially constructed, that's cultural. And she looks at the cultural nature of our understanding understanding of time. To do that, she turns to sociological theorist Emil Durkheim. And he noted that it's so hard to even think critically about time, because how do we imagine it without thinking about it in the categories that we divide it into, without thinking about it in the categories of minutes, hours, days, weeks. So it's hard to even think about time. But then he says, what's the origin of the differentiation? Where do these categories come from? And he says they come from social life. Minutes don't exist in nature, right? The concept of a minute, the concept of a day. It comes from social life. It's a set of shared cultural understandings that we develop in social life. Now, for Greenhouse, linear time, the ideas that we hold about time are cultural. They come from social life, just like all other forms of time. Recent scholarship, literary scholar Thomas Allen argues, has demonstrated that changes in time consciousness, changes in ideas about time, cannot be explained as a story of progress from a more primitive to a more rational organization of time. Instead, the homogeneity of time that's supposed to result from the centrality of clocks, watches, etc., is only possible if technologies produce time by themselves. But once we start asking, what did people do with technologies of time? Why did they want such technologies? The homogeneity of modern national time begins to shatter into a myriad fragments of heterogeneous, local, and transient temporal cultures. And these different ways of thinking about time, he argues, don't drive us apart, but are instead the threads out of which the fabric of national belonging has long been woven. So the work of this interesting body of, literary, historical, and anthropological scholars working on the issue of time itself helps us to see, in Allen's words, that time is not a transhistorical phenomenon, an aspect of nature, or a product of technology existing outside of society, but is an historical artifact produced by human beings acting within specific historical circumstances. Now, I go through all of that simply to make the point that just as our understanding of clock time comes from social life, our idea of wartime, as it appears in American legal and political thought, is also a historical artifact, a historically contingent set of meanings that derive not from the essential nature of either war or of time. We need to view wartime, like linear time, as social time. Now, since we're in Cleveland, I have to share with you my first chapter. It talks about time, and I was dealing with the problem of how am I going to keep my reader on board and get my reader, which would be scholars but also others, people interested in thinking critically about wartime, how am I going to get them on board for this chapter where I'm going to make them listen to Durkheim? So I needed a story, and so my story was the enactment of wartime during World War II, which was a law providing that there was going to be daylight savings time all year long as an energy-saving measure. And how did people react to that? So I figured, well, Ohio's a farm state, and I knew that farmers really had issues with year-long daylight savings time. So I called up what I call my Oberlin-based research group, my daughter, and her friend went to the library looking for stories about farmers in Ohio reacting to wartime, and they found something else. So wartime in Cleveland began at the circus. At the end of a circus performance in Cleveland, Ohio, Cleveland's mayor, Frank J. Lausch, who went on to be Ohio's governor, ceremoniously advanced 2 clocks after the last performance of the Grotto Circus. In doing so, he brought Cleveland's time into sync with year-long daylight savings time, which was literally called wartime. The mayor told the circus crowd in an address broadcast on the radio that the change in time was gratifying because of the electricity it would save for war work. Around the country, time changed at 2 a.m. Standard Time on February 9th, 1942, in compliance with a new federal law establishing daylight savings time as an energy-saving measure. But farmers and others objected to the federal government basically messing with time. Standard Time itself was a human construction, but for many Americans it seemed as if it was God-given, and they objected to giving it up. One Minnesota farmer complained, to delude oneself that it is 6 o'clock when the sun, moon, and stars and God in heaven have ordained that it is but 5 o'clock, I believe justifies, and this quote is in the Congressional Record, it's a statement that the so-called daylight savings time probably stands at the head of the list of complete asininity. A representative of the National Grange then objects on behalf of dairy farmers who would have to get up at 3 instead of 4 a.m. They must work in harmony with natural law or they work at no purpose at all, he insisted. But the nature hadn't changed, right? Only the name of the hour that they had to rise. Okay, so what does this all have to do with law and politics? because we're thought to have two kinds of time, wartime and peacetime, and law is thought to be different during wartime, right? The ancient saying, in time of war, law is silent. Law isn't silent, but it's generally assumed that it speaks differently during wartime. And the idea that war is an exceptional, a different time, outside of regular politics, can become a justification for extreme policies. Historian Lynn Hunt notes that during the French Revolution, Bertrand Barrère claimed that his era compelled his acts of repression. He said that he did not at all shape my epoch, my time of revolution and political storms. I only did what I had to do, obey it. He had to obey his time. The idea that war times are exceptional moments enables the idea that one is driven or determined by time. Now, for this formulation to work, war has to be confined in time, right? Have temporal beginnings and endings. So Jeffrey Stone sees war this way in his important leading work on free speech in wartime. And he has these chapters that track different wars and their impact on First Amendment rights. Wartime is exceptional, he argues. Peacetime makes up 80% of the nation's history. So just looking at the 20th century, which is what I do, let's look at the wars that might figure in his understanding of American history. And this isn't exactly his formulation, but it's pretty close. He has a World War I chapter, a World War II chapter, a Cold War chapter, so Korea sort of fits into the Cold War, but the Cold War chapter ends in 1957. Think about that. Sputnik, 58, Cuban Missile Crisis, 61. The Cold War goes on, but the Cold War's impact on civil liberties doesn't apparently. And then Vietnam. Okay, so that's the understanding of American history as being 80% peacetime. We could then go, 19th century historians always tell me, you got to go talk about the 19th century and the ongoing nature of military conflict then. But if we just take the 20th century, now what would be another way of looking at wartime? And there's a lot of different ways to go about thinking about what are other measures of conflict. And the one I've been using has been U.S. military campaign service medals. Now, campaign service medals are medals given to troops for honorable service. They're not medals for valor, other than just that you were there and you did your job and you served well, so that you get an honorable discharge at the end of it. So and Congress enacts them, right? So the government said, this is a conflict under fire for which you get a medal. So if we look at just 20th century medals, we could do a contest and see how many you think there were, how many years. So there's my slide. Okay, we could end up arguing about this conflict or that, but the bottom line is there was so much more deployment of American service members overseas, wearing uniforms, taking weapons, shooting happened, people died, okay? Looks pretty much like a war. Now, of course, you could say, well, a lot of those aren't declared, but of course the last declared war is World War II. So even if we wanted to work with that formulation, we kind of run into problems after 1945. So the purpose of this is just to say to you, there's a whole lot more military conflict, U.S. military engagement in American history that fits into our narratives of the impact of war on rights at home. Now, you might say, but there's some wars that really were bound in time, like we know when World War II happened. Okay. Basically what I'm trying to do is mess with your understanding of time, okay? So if you end up confused at the end of the lecture, sorry, that's sort of what I was trying to do. Okay, so now let's look at World War II and a murder case on a U.S. Army base where the defendant's life depended on when World War II ended. And the Supreme Court had to rule on the question of whether it was over by 1949. Okay, John Lee was a prisoner at the U.S. Army disciplinary barracks at Camp Cook, and he was a bad guy. He was basically already incarcerated, and then with 2 colleagues committed a murder inside the prison. So not a very nice guy. They're convicted by and sentenced to death by a court-martial. And the difficulty with the case is that under Article 92 of the Laws of War, no person shall be tried by court-martial for murder or rape committed within the geographical limits of the United States in time of peace. The crime was June 10th, 1949. So whether or not the court-martial was lawful turned on whether June 10th, 1949 was wartime or peacetime. Okay, so was World War II over by then? What are the possibilities? And you're going to say, I know when it ended, September 1945. Okay. We've got Germany's surrender, Japan surrender. Truman then announces the cessation of hostilities December 31, 1946. And if I remember correctly, the Campaign Service Medal for World War II goes to the end of 1946. Truman, by the way, said, you know, why would he proclaimed cessation of hostilities, but said a state of war still exists. Why did he say that hostilities were over if there was still a state of war? And he said it was in the public interest to declare that hostilities were terminated. So we have this sort of messiness about are we in war or not? As late as 1951, as a legal matter, the nation was still in a state of war with Germany. Truman called for an end to that state of war in July 51, but stressed that the American occupation of Germany would continue. A declaration of peace with Japan was in April 1952. Okay, these various endings to the war, of course, some of them had happened after the crime, but the various endings to the war leave the court in something of a muddle. How are they going to pick which ending counts for the purpose of this case? In an earlier case, Ludica versus Watkins, the court held that ending a state of war was a political act, and courts should defer to the judgment of other branches. In Wood versus Cloyd Miller, also in 1948, the Supreme Court upheld a rent control law as an appropriate exercise of Congress's war powers. This act was passed in 1947 and concerned a post-war housing crisis. The court said that the war power does not necessarily end with cessation of hostilities, but includes the power to remedy the evils which have arisen from its rise and progress. Prohibition laws were upheld after World War I under a similar rationale. So these cases basically didn't drive Justice Douglas in Madigan. He argued that Congress, in drafting he argues for the majority, Congress in drafting laws may decide that the nation may be at war for one purpose and at peace for another. The court's job was to determine whether, in the sense of this law, peace had arrived. So basically, we're looking at a statute. Knowing whether it's wartime or peacetime depends on how we interpret this particular statute, so we can be at war for one statute and at peace for war for one statute and at peace for another. And what the court in previous cases had found the war powers to extend long beyond the dates of surrender. But Madigan was about a military tribunal's ability to try people for capital offenses. And I think Douglas just didn't like that. So he basically reads into the case and reads into Article 92 his sense of what common sense is, holding that the date of the crime was a time of peace as those words were used in that article. So this example illustrates that even for the 20th century's most iconic American war, there is an uneasy and uncertain relationship between war time and war power. War provides the occasion for the use of war powers, but it is hard to contain them within war times. So there's a lot more to say, but let's go back to what can be said about our latest wartime. Once a catalytic moment like 9/11 is thought about as the opening of an era that necessarily has an end. I mean, that's my argument, that wartime, built into the concept, is wartime is an era that necessarily has an end because, of course, peacetime at some point will arrive. So when we think about an era that way, we persist in assuming its temporary character, at least until we stop thinking about it. This affects much more than the toleration for rights restriction in wartime. War's temporariness has been a justification for presidential unilateralism. The dust had not yet settled in Lower Manhattan before one of the features of the post-9/11 era began to emerge. As the events of September 11th unfolded, amid the shock and the horror was a discomforting narrative ambiguity. What was this? Before September 11th, the words terrorism and war had not been conflated. There were two categories, two problems calling for different responses. The most parallel recent occurrence, of course, had been the April 1995 Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh. From the beginning, September 11th was seen as a day that changed everything. The conflict had broken time, had opened a new era. The enemies of freedom had committed an act of war against our country, President Bush told the nation in a major address on September 20, 2001. Ultimately, the war on terror was conceptualized sort of like the Cold War era, a time when the United States opposed an ideology that could be found anywhere in the globe. A new kind of terrorism, sort of like communism, seemed an amoeba-like mass that could pop up anywhere. Once the enemy was not a nation state or even an identifiable social group, but an ideology, war seemed to have no boundaries in space or time, but seeped into the global spaces where those evil ideas reside. If the war on terror lacked boundaries of traditional war times, the justification for new policies, from domestic surveillance to detention at Guantanamo to waterboarding, nevertheless was, it's a wartime, as if war itself compelled these kinds of policies. Americans proceeded to impose traditional categories on an unruly present. If the president seemed to do this to rally public support for the administration's response to the attacks, he was not alone. A war narrative was reinforced in American popular culture. And in the chapter, I talk about how this comes out of what was one of the first films relating to 9/11, which was United 93. Scholars debated whether the era was a wartime. I mean, there were really lots of big fights in the scholarship about what was this? Was it a wartime? But most responded to the era's ambiguity not by jettisoning the categories, but by renaming and reimposing them. Crisis or emergency became dominant framing devices, but they coalesced around a conventional understanding. The idea that there was something called normal time that was periodically ruptured and restored in American history. Whatever title might be ascribed to the new era, it was not normal time. Now, one of the more curious turns in post-9/11 legal scholarship was the embrace of the work of German theorist and Nazi Party member Carl Schmitt. References to Schmitt proliferated in an ongoing discourse of exceptionality, the idea that normal time is ruptured by non-normal time. And this is a chart of citations to Schmitt in legal scholarship. Schmitt's, sometimes the citations were simply to quote one line out of one of his books: "The sovereign is he who declares the exception." This seemed to fit. I think this is one of the reasons that people sort of went to Schmitt. It seemed to fit the post-9/11 context perfectly, since President Bush had declared that we had entered an exceptional moment of wartime, that had commenced with the September 11th attacks. Panels on Schmitt at scholarly conferences were heavily attended, and citations increased. Invocations of Schmitt became a language for discussing executive power even for scholars who decried his influence. Drawing from the experience of Weimar Germany, Schmidt served as an important warning that democracy can fall apart when security concerns stemming from war or crisis seep into domestic politics. But the turn to Schmidt reinforced this discourse of exceptionality, seeing the post-9/11 years as a departure from normal time. Consistent across this literature was the idea that time had changed on September 11th, that it had ushered in a new era. And we have seemed to be largely stuck in an analysis that seemed to make abuses of executive power inevitable. If executive abuses of power are inevitable, this also excuses the rest of us from the political work that might generate more effective restraints on presidential power. It is if we are all determined by our times, as if wartime deprives us of agency and responsibility. Now, political philosopher John Brankman, I think, helps us with a way out of this, I think, over-determinative discourse. In a book on political thought since September 11th, he argues that Schmidt's formulation of the sovereign as he who declares the exception, so that usually these arguments are, we have the exception and then everything follows from there, and we have this inevitable rise in executive power. So Brankman argues that Schmidt's formulation obscures the little wedge created by the distinction and hence the potential gap between declaration and claim, act and justification, rule and legitimacy. It is here, he says, along these hairline fractures in the discourse of power, that there is the very possibility of a political realm and of democracy. So what does he mean for us? Where does this hairline fracture appear in legal thought, and how is it managed? Legal scholars writing about the post-9/11 era, like those engaging the Cold War and other conflicts, tend to take external events like wars as a given, right? The crisis exists out there in the world, and it is legal scholars' task to take up the impact of these external events on law's functioning. The crisis exists out there, and law reacts until the crisis goes away. But as political scientist Adam Berinsky argues, the facts of war do not speak for themselves. In his work on the impact of war on public opinion, he talks about the way Americans sometimes they react to global events like September 11th or like Pearl Harbor, but most of the time in the context of war, as in the context of other events, the people react not simply to what's happening out there in the world, but to the way it's framed in elite discourse and partisan politics. So, how do we understand what's happening now in Iraq and Afghanistan? We actually don't have a sort of a natural tie-in to the conflict on the ground, right? Although, even if you're seeing it through online feeds, directly to the war zone, what we've got is a narration of the war, an interpretation of the war, an argument about the war. And so Brankman's argument is that's where the public opinion comes from. It's generated in reaction to not the geopolitics themselves, but to the way it's mediated through those sources like the media that give us access to the information in the first place. So there's that filtering device. So we need to interrogate the way military conflict is conceptualized, is narrated, and communicated, and the way arguments about war, not the use of military materiel itself, not the bombers and even the drones themselves, right? But the way they're conceptualized and the arguments that people are making about them, how that affects American thinking about war. Following from Brankman, the exception, the idea that we are in an exceptional era where the rules are going to be different, derives not only from something external, but the wedge between declaration and claim, act and justification The need for legitimacy puts the possibility of politics in the middle of identifying the state of exception. So, for example, when Bush had that powerful moment at Ground Zero, when he took up the microphone and said the rest of the world is going to hear from us, and then when he followed shortly thereafter and narrated September 11th as a war, the reason that worked is because it was thought. The reason his policies were enacted and he had so much political power from that moment going forward is that people found it convincing, got behind him, and worked within that narrative. But the fact that there is that it's not that there's the declaration of that it's a war and then everything follows from then, but Brinkman says there's a political space within which the issue of legitimacy has to be constructed. So it's the declaration of exception, and the need to justify it, to legitimate it. That, he says, is the moment where politics can come in. The crisis or war isn't external to the world of politics that law occupies. Instead, the exceptionality derives from something internal and something political, the framing or articulation of crisis and justification. So it's not that there's something happening in geopolitics that is driving us in some necessary direction, right? But it's our interpretation of what's happening overseas. It's our interpretation of threats around the world, the need for interpretation and legitimation means that there's this moment for arguments, a moment for politics, right? That we're not all somehow naturally driven by security threats that happen in the world, that we have an entry into this political space where we can actually have a discussion, right? I'm not even saying which way it should come out, but that there needs to be politics in this moment of is this a war? What kind of security threat is there? What kind of response is necessary? Are we on board for the kind of policies that our government is pursuing, as opposed to President, whether it's Bush or Obama, declaring that we have a war and sending American forces or machines there, and the American people essentially checking out of the process and seeing that they have no place in the discussion. So it's along this hairline fracture in that political space that we see the construction of the idea of wartime. It is there that the narrative work is done, framing an episode as a war and placing it in the legacy of great American conflicts. For all of the challenges of George Bush's presidency, he succeeded completely, I think, in this most fundamental task, rallying the nation behind the idea of war. The greatest challenge to the idea that our time is exceptional is simply the facts on the ground. If the war on terror is a rupture of normal time, then it is inherently temporary and would last only until normal time was restored. As the era has pressed on, Americans turned their focus to their daily lives, even as American troops continued to patrol dangerous territory in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as American unmanned warplanes bombed targets in Pakistan and elsewhere. This was not so exceptional, however, for ongoing smaller-scale wars have been a feature of American international relations for the last century. Remember that slide. It has been instead the passage of what has become normal time in America. And this brings us back to the end of a war. I'm sorry, I missed that slide. The end of a war that hasn't ended. If even Obama can become so Orwellian, then we have truly come to a sorry state in the history of American politics. Constitutional scholars have decried the rush to a new war in Libya without the authorization of Congress, but the absence of limits on warfare rests not so much with the people's representatives in Congress, but with the people ourselves. to bring the politics back into American war policy. A starting point is to essentially stop seeing us as having been driven or determined by our times. And to do that, we might have to recognize that the law and politics we have during war is not a suspension of normal politics that someday is going to go away, right? So don't worry about it. It's wartime. It's going to pass. Instead, it's our everyday law and politics, which we as citizens must take responsibility for. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. This lecture is being webcast, which means that there are viewers out in the internet's land. And as a consequence, we ask you to come down to the microphones instead of just shouting out your question.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm sort of cheating because I knew Bob was going to say that, so I got up in front of everybody else. As you were giving your wonderful presentation, I thought back to the 12th Brumaire of l'année 2, which was, of course, the 12th, I think it's the 31st of October, 1792, if I remember correctly. Which is the measurement of time that the revolution had brought in France. I think that's when Napoleon actually sort of took over the triumvirate. In Britain, they were still calling it October 31st, whatever it was, 1792 or something. So I'm not sure the difference of measurement or quantification of time mattered so much to the folks who were there. If you're in France or if you're in the UK, you knew there was something going on that people called war, and it went on for about 24 years, 25 years. We call it the Napoleonic Wars. They actually just called it the conflict, or if you were in France, I guess it was the struggle. And so maybe instead of concentrating, talk about wartime, instead of talking so much about how you measure time or the quantity of time, the focus should be on the quantity of war. Whether you call it war or perhaps conflict, we should say, let's look at how much war is going on, how much conflict is going on, and if at that particular moment, whether it's the Brumaire or if it's October, I seem to recall that the revolutionaries actually wanted to, they divided up the year into 10 months, and then they wanted to divide the day up into 10 hours, but then they said, no, God has determined the number of hours, but not the number of months. Feet went, meters came in. So it's not so much the measurement, but it's the intensity of what was being experienced by the folks. And I think this is what kind of folds into what you were saying at the end. They would say, yes, at this particular moment, however we refer to this moment, the intensity of conflict is so great that it's going to affect the way in which we deal with the world. Maybe at that moment the king says, okay, the intensity is so great, I'm going to have the press and force people to join the Navy. And sometime actually after there was a peace treaty that wasn't really followed, and the press was lifted for a while. And you could say, all right, whatever you call it, war or whatever, the conflict has gotten down below some sort of level where those special concerns no longer exist, depending on what they are. And perhaps that's 9/11. There was an intensity of conflict for a while. It started to dip. Okay, so those special rules that we consider, not at wartime, but at war or intensity, we don't consider them. Then it goes up. You have to have some sort of scale for measuring intensity.
Okay, thank you. So let me talk about the issue of intensity. One of the things that that's interesting about the 20th century history of American war is, World War II is called total war, but I don't think Cleveland got bombed, right? First time I ever gave this paper, someone objecting to the paper said, people know when they're in a war, and she talked about the bombs falling through coming through the ceiling, and when she was in London in the Battle of Britain. So one of the things about the American war experience is that nearly everything in the 20th century happens somewhere else. And sometimes we think of ourselves as being in total war. And there was an effort to directly engage all of the American people during World War II. But the kind of intensity that Americans might feel, for most Americans, doesn't relate to the shooting in close proximity to where they are, right? It might have to do with whether their loved ones are deployed. It might have to do with whether they live now in a base community, as opposed to, somewhere where there's not, a military base close by. And then, the intensity is so often, it's privatized to military contractors now, and it's felt by, the people where the ordinance is being dropped, right? So the issue of intensity is really interesting for Americans, especially in the post-World War II years. There are three things that happen that essentially lessen the engagement of American people with American war policy. And on some level, that's my central concern, which I'm actually going to talk about in a more detailed way in my next book. But how it is that we end up with this moment when we've essentially given our presidents so much power to go it alone without our having a say or even seemingly a place at the table, and that in part comes from this distancing of the American people from the conduct of American war. How does that happen? No draft. The rise of military contracting. It was one contractor to 16 troops in Vietnam. Now it's 50-50, right? You used to draft someone to go make the soup, right? Now we just hire a contractor to do it. And also the use of technology, so that after the first Gulf War, American military planners said, we've solved the problem, the American people, the problem for Vietnam, that we can't have a war without the support of the American people, because now the American people are with us, because war looked like a video game, right? So you had the smart bombs that went right into the bunker, and that's how we viewed it on television. And so we could even imagine that civilians on the ground weren't getting hurt. So we have this distancing of the So the lack of intensity that Americans may feel doesn't necessarily have a relationship to the use of the American war power, right? And so I think that that's an important thing to think about. But if the measure of war that we're going to pay attention to is the intensity of feelings at home, well, then we're going to miss a lot of what our government is doing, because we've been protected from the costs of war. I mean, remember post 9/11, we were told to go shopping, go on vacation, or the terrorists have won, right? Not plant a victory garden and contribute bonds to the war effort. I mean, that was what happened during World War II. Not just to raise money for the war, but to cement this relationship between the American people and the project of World War II. So I think that's one of the things that we have to look at, is this distancing, which then I think undermines there being an engagement with war politics. When we don't have an engagement with war politics, we don't have a check on executive power.
Thank you very much for this really interesting talk. And boy, are you right about the resurgence of Carl Schmitt. I mean, my colleague Ken Ledford and I were just at the German Studies Association, and you could not escape it. So absolutely true. The one thing that I thought was somewhat missing from the analysis of wartime is that, yes, everything you say is great, and we should go back and be rational, and we should go back and analyze. The problem is that apparently psychologically people are not ready to do so. And I think there is a real element of contagion that goes on in these moments, and we see this in history over and over again. Even the introduction of conflict that is not there in order to create a hype, in order to create a certain amount of contagion, of panic. And that is extremely powerful, and I'm not sure that we just by reason and by calling for reason or by calling for common sense can actually get away from this. So, and I'm not sure what to do against this. It's scary when you see it. What happens that when even people that you think are reasonable get caught up in this contagious atmosphere. And I think that's extremely responsible for this whole idea of wartime, how we have to act in wartime, how it does become suddenly a state of exception. Just to give one example, since you mentioned 9/11, I recently worked on Jonathan Safran's fourth novel, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. And actually, one of the biggest criticisms that there's a main character whose father is killed in the World Trade Center bombing, one of the biggest criticisms by many critics was that, well, it's not enough of a state of exception in the novel. He might as well have died in a car crash, the father. And that wasn't enough for them. So apparently that's not traumatic enough. It has to be something that is dying in the World Trade Center is something different than dying in a car crash. Although if one steps back, really the effect can be quite the same on the person who has to suffer by losing the father. So, so this weird hype that we connect to this that goes really through all levels of society seems to be some psychological basis in us that we respond to panic and trauma in this way.
Yeah, that was very helpful, and I'd love to talk with you afterwards about the literature on contagion. I have the wartime book, and then the next book. I was supposed to be writing this big book, and then I got it was driving me crazy how people were talking about wartime. So I basically had to do this first, and then I go back and think about the 20th century in a much more textured way. So in this book, you don't see everything you'd like to see, because all I'm trying to do is point out and criticize this thinking about time. Now, going forward, I think you're absolutely right that there are these catalytic moments, sort of like Frankfurter after Pearl Harbor, these catalytic moments that have this disruptive impact, that have a broad cultural impact, and that's where Berinsky's argument that our perception of war is always mediated, he says, in moments like this, there's more of a direct connection with what's happening in the world. So I think one of the challenges for my 20th century narrative is to think about how to really give weight to these, what I think of as these catalytic moments, these moments of great trauma, while still trying to write a narrative that's not working within this formulaic frame, that this moment opens an era that by definition comes to an end, right? And in terms of thinking about scholars writing about war, right? So 10 years after, I think we're done with the contagion, right? And so 10 years after, certainly scholars looking at this era, trying to shove it back into these temporally confined war times. Some aren't, but largely, the effort has been to compare this war with our other war times, it doesn't work, it doesn't fit. So that's what the criticism is focused on, but I think you're absolutely right, that even if we sort of take off the boundaries of war times, we still have to take into account, how do these ruptures, these moments happen? How do we take into account their impact on politics? Is there a way to separate it out, these moments themselves from their narration, essentially? To me, the Brinkman's book on political thought after 9/11 is so inspiring to me because he suggests that it's not all overdetermined. It's not that you have these catalytic moments and then necessarily certain things fall into place, but that the narration or the construction of what this moment was and what happens going forward, that's an act of judgment. And that's where there can be a moment for politics.
We have two of you. We are technically a little over time. I'm going to ask the two of you each to ask your question quickly in succession. And
I'll answer as quickly as I can.
And Mary will somehow weave the two together and lead us out afterwards to a reception. I don't expect you to lead us out, but that we will.
You can. Thank you.
Well, my question's pretty short to begin with. I simply had a question that since you want to deviate from a year basis or a temporal basis, that this leaves the possibility that by different nations that they'll define wartime as however you define it now by differently. For instance, if you use your medals example for using wartime, a winning nation and a losing nation would then define the time of war differently. And so I was wondering if you've noticed, and I don't know if you've looked at it, how, whether you've won or lost a war, however you want to define that, you can use the Americans versus the Germans and Japanese in World War II. Will they define wartime differently? And then when similar, I guess, executive power grasps happen in the future, how does the fact that you won or lost a war affect how that loss transfers into the greater society at large and then with future power grabs?
Okay, thanks.
My name is Ali Fortia, Libyan student here, LLM student. I would wish that you gave us like a definition, your definition to the war term.
To the what?
War, to the war. I believe it's very important because you mentioned in the last part of your lecture, you mentioned to the Libyan case.
Libya?
Yes,
Yeah.
and I believe the operation Libya was under the Security Council. So, with your definition includes the operations that has been or have been done under the Security Council resolution. We all know that unless the United States and its allies intervened in the right time, the world could have seen a hysterical massacre in Libya. Thousands of Libyan people could have been killed unless the United States and its allies intervened on March 19th. So, and we all know that the operation in Libya was done under the United Nations resolution.
Yeah.
So is that war too?
Okay, I'm going to take up both of these questions somewhat quickly. Thank you so much. On Libya, I support the United States having gotten involved in Libya. However, I object to the administration doing it without the involvement with Congress. The fact that it's through the UN or the Security Council, I think, doesn't help. The Obama administration interpreted the War Powers Act as not kicking in because if it's not a hostility under the War Powers Act if American soldiers aren't personally at risk. And I have to say, as we've got American soldiers in bunkers in New Mexico and Arizona, who were basically pushing the button to drop the ordinance from drones. Does this mean we can engage in military action everywhere, but Congress has no role as long as American soldiers aren't personally at risk? I think that's we can't allow technology to essentially, multiply the president's ability to go it alone, to use weaponry around the world in circumstances we might think are just and circumstances we might disagree with, without the American people playing a role. The way the American people play a role is through Congress playing a role, especially through the War Powers Resolution. So I support our having acted in Libya. I do not agree with the way the Obama administration went about it. On the issue of other countries, I'm not remembering where the person is who asked, thank you. And I'm not so sure it's won or lost, but it's certainly the case that different countries look at wars and their periodization differently. And if you take the Cold War, for example, David Anderson is writing what's going to be a tremendously important book on the Cold War in Africa. For him, the dynamics of what was the Cold War in Africa end with the Rwandan genocide. And for scholars of Asia, it covers a vastly longer period of time, from way earlier to way later than the way Americans conceptualize the Cold War. So when we start looking at other countries, what particular war eras were is very, very different. Thanks so much.
I was going to ask you to please join me in thanking Mary, but you did that spontaneously. We do have a gift for you from the Institute. There is a reception.